Hey everybody, it's your host AR, and I am beyond excited for what we have coming up next on the Diplomacy and Discourse podcast. This week, we dive into one of the most explosive and sobering reads of the year, Putin's Sledgehammer, the Wagner Group, and Russia's Collapse into Mercenary Chaos, by Candace Rondeaux. This is not just a book about Russia or Ukraine. It's a wake-up call. It's about the collapse of accountability, the rise of mercenary warfare, and how one man's hunger for power destabilized global security through a private army of extremists, criminals, and killers. Candace doesn't just report, she exposes. With deep scouring and razor-sharp insight, she unpacks the story of the Wagner Group in a way that will leave you speechless. Don't forget to like and subscribe, share us your thoughts, email us at diplomacyanddiscourse@gmail.com. Now, let's get into it. All right, everybody, welcome back to Diplomacy and Discourse podcast. I'm your host, AR, and today's guest is someone whose work I've come to recently admire. Not only for sharp political insight, but for her courage to dig where others won't. Joining me is Candace Rondeaux, a renowned journalist, strategic analyst, and scholar whose work has been featured in the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, The Guardian, and beyond. She's currently a senior fellow at the Center on the Future of War at Arizona State University, and is the senior director for Future Frontlines and directs the Planetary Politics initiatives at New America. Candace has spent decades investigating the intersection of political violence, disinformation, and authoritarianism, with a special focus on the post-Soviet world. Her latest book, Putin's Sledgehammer, the Wagner Group, and Russia's Collapse into Mercenary Chaos, is a gripping expose that pulls no punches. It examines how a rogue mercenary army, once a tool of the Kremlin, grew so powerful it threatened to overshadow the Russian military itself. This is a story of war crimes, disinformation, betrayal, and the death of state accountability. And Candace documents it all with fearless precision. Candace, welcome to the show. It's an honor to have you.
Oh, it's so great to be here. Thank you. And thanks for that really kind introduction.
So, what sparked your interest in the Wagner Group, and how did this project evolve into Putin's Sledgehammer?
Yeah, there are so many different little things that kind of led me into this trail of trying to sniff out the Wagner Group, what it was about. I guess maybe three threads that are important to mention. The first is I have been looking at and studying and thinking about all things Russian since I was 14 years old in high school, stumbling through the Russian alphabet, trying to figure out and make sense of Cyrillic. I studied Russian history and culture and language as an undergrad, and then stumbled my way into a career in journalism, which oftentimes was really animated by the desire to become like the next bureau chief of of like Moscow for New York Times or Washington Post. That was like my fantasy. I didn't get that far. I actually ended up in Kabul for the Washington Post, but still, that's like one of the big threads. It's just the experience I had studying Russian. I lived in St. Petersburg in the 1990s, and I guess one of the kind of connective threads here is that it was exactly when Vladimir Putin was kind of rising to power. He was then deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, and little known to most of the world at the same time, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was this sort of CEO, impresario of the Wagner Group, mercenary army, was also kind of coming into his own at the same time. So all three of us were there in St. Petersburg, living probably only like blocks from each other. So that was kind of when I started kind of looking at trying to write about and report on the story of the Wagner Group. I was like, oh shit, pardon my language, but you know, that's kind of weird that we have that in common. And I don't really much remember anything about Putin at that time, but what I do know is that he obviously has been very influential in reshaping Russia. And for most of my career, I have been in and out of trying to report on or understand, Putin's Russia. And the Wagner Group came up really as a kind of question about Russia's ambition to reinvent itself on the world stage.
So, can you go a little back into history on the Wagner Group, how it started, why it evolved into the way it is now?
Yeah. So we have to kind of dial back all the way to the 1990s, early 1990s. Many people, of a certain age will remember that this, cataclysmic events happens, all across the Soviet Union, where, republic by republic begins to rebel against Soviet authority. It kind of spreads almost like a wildfire in the Baltics first, reaches Ukraine, part of the Caucasus, and what is precipitating this is economic free fall in the country that's caused partially by the Soviet Union's long-term involvement in Afghanistan. And it's that war that leads to kind of the economic collapse of the country and this long-standing race with the United States at the end of the Cold War, the so-called missile gap race, and the race to escalate the capacity to foment nuclear war. So fast forward a little bit to, let's say 1992, 93, and a couple things are happening. One, the country is really shuddering from this huge political and economic shock, and people are poor as hell. Retirement accounts are dried up. I mean, just there's no food. But the one kind of group or social caste that does have access to food and money is the Russian mafia, which at the time in the early 1990s was next to the KGB the most powerful organized movement inside of Russia. And in fact, there was kind of a marriage of convenience that happened in the early 1990s between the KGB, which later became the FSB security service, kind of like the Russian FBI, and Russian organized crime groups. And lo and behold, at the same time, while this is happening, a bunch of veterans from the Afghan war are returning home, and guess what? They're out of work.
Hmm.
And they're out of work at a time when the Russian military is trying to find its footing, and the government is privatizing everything. And this is the moment when we first see the appearance of private security companies all across domestic Russia, so Moscow, St. Petersburg, big cities, and they're doing the things that you would normally think of, providing bodyguard protection for rich people and businessmen, doing surveillance and protection of certain valuable properties. Um, at this stage, there is no private military contractor service or there's no industry per se. But what is happening is there's a merger between the security services, between organized crime, between these out of work veterans, and then these kind of new rising private security companies that are domestic in nature. Um, Fast forward to 2008, and now Putin is really in power. And the Russian military is still struggling because of this economic challenge, still struggling because of longstanding corruption. There's a war in Georgia that goes okay for Russia,
Hmm.
but it really reveals a lot of the weaknesses of the Russian military. And
Hmm.
it's at that moment that another effort to privatize another part of Russia, most importantly the military, sets off this race to develop what is now what we call the private military contracting, industry in Russia. And it's out of that, plus Yevgeny Prigozhin's longstanding relationship with Putin, that we get some of the first experimentations in expeditionary private military contractors, like the Wagner Group.
So, has there been any jaw-dropping things that you discovered that would make the readers think like, I can't believe Putin got away with this? There's something with maybe the annexation of Crimea too that occurred later after the.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are so many jaw-dropping moments for me in the reporting and writing of this book. Some of them unfolded literally like as I was typing like the last chapters
Mhm.
of the book. But I guess, the one I think that's really interesting is, I mean, you mentioned Crimea and the invasion, the little green men appearing on the Crimean Peninsula suddenly, mysteriously. And it was there that we start to see this experimentation, this deployment of small scale battalions of men with no insignia, uniforms that are kind of weirdly not very easy to distinguish. Their faces are masked. And first they're in Crimea, and then suddenly they're marching across into Donbass. Nobody knows who's in charge. And it's at this moment that we start to understand that the Russian government is very much behind this separatist uprising in eastern Ukraine in 2014. But still, even then, nobody knew sort of like what battalion was what battalion. Everything had like sort of like, alias names. And you might remember in July 2014, there was this huge event where a commercial jetliner out of Amsterdam, a Malaysia jetliner
Mm.
MH17, flew over Ukraine and was down by some sort of fire, some sort of missile. And it was at that moment that the kind of the roads and the mystery of what was going on in Donbass started to become a little bit more clear. And we started to hear kind of, crackling on the radios about a guy named Wagner. Um, and it was the experimentation, that those experimental battalion groups, that was led by a guy named Dmitry Utkin, that had the name Wagner, call sign Wagner. That's really the origin story. But what's interesting is that for from that moment forward, 2014, summer 2014, Putin was able to convince the world that Russia had nothing to do with this mercenary army.
Okay. The book does draw a link between the Wagner Group and what you said earlier, the erosion of the Russian state. Do you believe Putin intentionally hollowed out formal institutions to empower proxies like Wagner?
It's kind of a chicken and egg question, actually. I think the hollowing out was a little bit of sort of natural entropy that occurs when nobody else um, can be in charge, but mafia and security services. Um, Eventually, what that means is if there's only two social groups that control most of the levers of power in a country, then you're going to get a hollowing out that's kind of just natural. Um, and by necessity, some of the bigger institutions like the military um, are going to still need talent, though, if things escalate to the point where Russia has to go to war. And we saw that happen in Chechnya, right? So some of the early experiments in deploying sort of proxies or um, individuals who claimed to be one thing but were another really started with some of the fractiousness in the Caucasus in the mid 1990s, particularly in Chechnya and Georgia, and some of the experimentation, right, with using kind of ghost armies to further Russia's aims really started to play out much more aggressively after the Russo-Georgian War in 2008.
Hmm.
And yeah, I mean, I think the hollowing out progressed in large part because then, um, the Kremlin started to expand the circle of people who could benefit from this sistema, as they call it in Russia, right? Which is sort of
Hmm.
the system by which, corruption and organized crime and abuse of security services kind of
Hmm.
mixes together. And it's through sistema that you start to see the expansion of what should be private started to be kind of absorbed by the state through proxies like Yevgeny Prigozhin.
Have you observed any sort of dangerous, for lack of better words, dynamics between uh, interactions with Trump this term versus Trump's first term, and even if there is something with between Obama and Biden too? Has there been any similarities and differences between that?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting segue. I mean, if you need to draw like a line between sort of how authoritarianism has unfolded in Russia and the way in which we've been dealing and wrestling with this kind of murky narrative about Donald Trump, his connections to Russia, the ways in which, the Trump administration in his first term attempted to hollow out institutions. and is now very aggressively in his second term, hollowing out institutions. Yeah, there's a lot of threads to draw on there. But I mean, I think what I can say is that it has been really fascinating to watch how some of the narratives that authoritarian governments, particularly those like Russia, have seeped into the body politic of the United States, and really become a polarizing factor. And we're now speaking in August of 2025, and once again, um, the story of Russia and Trump has kind of come to the fore, largely of his own making. For a while, I think it kind of had laid dormant since the 2016 presidential election, where there was allegations of Russian interference in the election on behalf of Trump, or at least in sort of putting a thumb on the scale in favor of Trump. And now it's come to the fore again in an effort, seemingly by Trump and his administration, to criminalize even asking the question about whether there was interference.
Yeah, because, Obama dealt with, the with what occurred with Georgia, and then also in the annexation of Crimea. Trump, like you just said earlier, had, this issue with, supposed Russian, or not supposed, if you put it that way, Russian interference. And then Biden, with the invasion of Ukraine, and now Trump's sort of dealing with this whole, trying to get a deal out of this. So then throughout, Biden's term, and now even into Trump's, we've seen Zelensky's public courage. And your book does reveal his behind the scenes battle with Wagner, because we just, us, the common listener, all common citizen, we don't know about Wagner until you expose this. So what surprised you the most about how he's handled these shadowy threats?
Yeah, I mean that's a good point. And let me just sort of emphasize it. Like what you just laid out, AR, is like this long thread that goes from Obama to
Mm-hmm.
Trump to Biden and back to Trump again. And Russia is there again and again. This
Mm-hmm.
problem of Ukraine has been so central to US politics, and frankly has undone several administrations. It has frustrated both Democrats and Republicans in terms of just trying to tamp down the conflagration that has been caused by this conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned Zelensky. I think a lot of people see Zelensky now, some 4 years into this conflict with Russia in Ukraine, as a kind of Churchillian figure, right? He's sort of like the Churchill of our era. He's challenging. He's kind of the David challenging Goliath, and
Mm-hmm.
really putting it to Putin where it hurts the most.
He was person of
Striking.
the year too.
He was Person of the Year,
Yeah.
and I don't think anybody would have expected that. I was in Kiev in 2019 on the campaign trail when Zelensky mounted his campaign for the presidency,
Mm.
and the key opponents there were Yulia Tymoshenko, who famously was kind of this heroic figure, a little bit besmirched, but certainly a heroic figure from the 2004 Orange Revolution. She was very well known for her pushback against Russian aggression and sort of creeping Russian influence in Ukrainian political culture. And then there's Petro Poroshenko, who was this kind of rich oligarch, sort of chocolate king of Ukraine. And these two were considered to be the front runners because they kind of had this incumbent sort of vibe to them, right? They were established politicians. And here comes this guy, a comedian, a filmmaker, a guy who had a show that was pretty popular, that was almost surreal in its kind of narrative line because, of course, he's like an average Joe who becomes president by accident. Um, and he's from Donbass, unlike these other two who are kind of not really from the center of the conflict. Zelensky is. And I think
Mm.
possibly because of that and his extreme charisma. I mean, he's just a really charismatic figure. I've seen him a few times in person. Um, and his mastery of social media, his understanding of media, those things combined to elevate him to the presidency in the summer of 2019, at a time when there's actually escalating conflict with Russia over a group of sailors who've been taken hostage after a conflict in the Sea of Azov. And I remember thinking, like, I don't know how this guy's going to survive.
Mm.
Like he just seems like out of his depth. And interestingly, in researching the story about sort of Zelensky's quiet battle with the Wagner Group, I
Hmm.
learned that it was almost precisely at the time that he becomes president that he's confronted with this challenge, where the security services of Ukraine have mapped out this very elaborate conspiracy to take a group of Wagner Group mercenaries into their custody through a very elaborate scheme in Belarus. That very nearly upends peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine at the time, exactly at the moment that Zelensky is trying to win over Putin's trust. And it's actually a weird little known fact that that Wagner Group episode was, I think, very much one of the main dynamics behind sowing this distrust between Putin and Zelensky and escalating the conflict to a full-blown war.
Did Zelensky anticipate the Wagner mutiny shocking the world? Has there
Oh,
been any warning signs that perhaps you spot that others, maybe even previous presidents, U.S. presidents, have missed?
yeah. Well, I certainly think that Zelensky was always a bit concerned because you have to remember if you think back to early 2022, just after the invasion got underway in Ukraine, there were some reports very early on about a number of assassination attempts. There was a joint list of like 22 people who were in Zelensky's cabinet and his government who were being targeted for assassination. And the rumor was, or the reporting was, that it was the Wagner Group that was supposed to carry out these assassinations. And it turned out to be a completely different mercenary group that had some network links to Wagner. But it was certainly uppermost on Zelensky's mind that the Wagner Group was going to be a challenge. And over time, of course, we saw Wagner Group march across Donbass and take huge portions of territory back from Ukrainian forces in a sort of back and forth tussle that led to this pinnacle moment in Bakhmut in the winter of 2022 and 2023. And I think for me, I think there are two signal moments where I was like, oh, you know what? Something's going to happen here. I mean, obviously, anybody with that kind of personality, Yevgeny Prigozhin kind of steps out of the shadows and into the limelight, starts kind of grabbing attention. He's in the news all the time after being hidden for basically, almost 2 decades. And people now are assuming, of course, that there is a connection between Putin and Prigozhin. So all of that narrative is completely blown up. But it's when Prigozhin goes public that you start to understand that he's worried. He's worried about losing his empire, losing grip on this, mercenary army that he's built and everything that's come with it, including, hundreds of millions of dollars from laundering gold, diamonds, etc., taken from Africa, oil, gas from the Middle East, from Syria, from Libya. And so it's the fact that he actually steps out of the shadows that kind of signals, he's worried. And then progressively, we see this campaign of leaks and attempts to damage him as he battles in Bakhmut. And he's raging against this. And this is all happening on social media. It's all happening on YouTube, on Telegram. Um, but the real moment, I think, the one that's sort of like, oh yeah, this guy is going to go down, or at least he's going to burn up his capital in some sort of clash was when in April 2023, and we're really in the middle of the Bakhmut battle now. Things are not going super well for the Wagner Group, even though there's progress. Um, and there's a bomb that goes off in St. Petersburg at his cafe. It was a cafe that not many people knew was actually his. And it was an assassination against one of his sort of fanboy military bloggers who he'd lent the cafe to. This was happening on Prigozhin's territory, his home turf, a place that really only somebody who knew him well would have hit to send a message. And that's when you knew Prigozhin was probably going to go down.
To kind of touch a little bit more on the horrific war crimes, I got about three questions around that. During your investigation, has there been any moments that you discovered that really disturbed you?
Oh, yeah. There's so many moments. I mean, the one that really stands out, and I meditated on a lot and I think about it, does give me flashbacks, is one I write about in the book. And it was in June of 2017. There was this video that appeared online. It was kind of this viral video. It first appeared, I think, on Telegram, and then kind of made its way around to Twitter and a couple other sites. And the video was a really short clip in some sort of desert landscape, where these guys in kind of gray, beige camo with their masks on their face, with AK-47 rifles in hand, were beating the hell out of a guy on the ground, an unarmed civilian, turned out to be a Syrian national who had left the country and come back to reconnect with family, and then somehow got sucked into um, fighting on behalf of Bashar al-Assad's army through several militias that were run by the Wagner Group. And then he somehow escaped. Nobody knew this, of course, at the time, but this moment on camera was so vivid, so graphic. They were beating him with a sledgehammer while he was crying out in pain. And later they dismembered him and beheaded him. It was one, and then set his body on fire. It was like one of the most horrific scenes that I had ever seen. I've seen a lot of things in my time. I reported on 9/11 right after the collapse of the World Trade Towers. I've been in Afghanistan and Pakistan at suicide bombings. And I was up front for those things. But this one, for some reason, just the graphicness of it really stuck with me.
Mhm.
And it was the first war crime that I became obsessed with trying to solve.
Has there been any global reaction from formal institutions in places like Syria, Ukraine, Mali to the atrocities committed by Wagner? And is there any local resistance to their presence?
Yeah, that's a good question. So over time, we've seen, Wagner appears more or less officially on the scene in summer of 2014, but there are other iterations of a kind of Wagner light in 2013 that were in Syria. But it starts to kind of accumulate more mass and power and momentum from roughly 2015 forward, when Russia officially announces its entry into the war in Syria. It's at that stage that it starts to spread, right? It moves from Syria. They open a base in Central African Republic, Sudan, and then there's the offensive in Libya. Um, the Wagner Group is basically catching fire as a business enterprise for Russia. And along the way, there are just countless war crimes that are documented by human rights groups, witnessed by locals. The place that stands out to me where there was considerable resistance to the Wagner Group's presence at first was in the Central African Republic, where there had been an ongoing civil war from 2012. And by the time the Wagner Group arrived in early in late 2017, early 2018, and began to deploy as kind of training instructors for the local forces, um, you know, things were kind of on fire. And there were pockets of resistance all over the country. Eventually, Wagner did accumulate a lot of popularity while in Central African Republic. But along the way, there were a lot of atrocity incidents. One of the more notable ones that everybody kind of knows about is the killing of three Russian journalists who went there to Central African Republic to document what was happening in 2018. Um, while those things were unfolding, the UN expert group on mercenaries opened a couple of inquiries and did a couple of studies looking at atrocities linked to the Wagner Group in all of these different places. And of course, human rights groups in Ukraine have been very closely documenting the activities of the Wagner Group all the way since 2014. I remember visiting a place in Kiev and talking to human rights experts there about sort of what they had seen, and it was quite evident, they've been linked to so many different, atrocity incidents, and that people were keeping track. We haven't seen anything officially from the ICC, the International Criminal Court. What we have seen and what we do know about is there was a civil society organization that lodged a pretty robust complaint describing what the Wagner Group's war crimes that are often shown online on Telegram um, and kind of bandied about in Mali. And this involved, the killing of multiple civilians who were unarmed all across Mali. Um, that brief that was issued, it's called an Article 15 brief, describes some pretty horrific crimes. And so far, the International Criminal Court hasn't really acted on it. But there have been since then calls in the Council of Europe for a special tribunal for the Wagner Group.
Do you believe the West adequately understands the dangers posed by groups like Wagner, or is there still a tendency to view them as like a Russia's problem?
Yeah, I think there has been an evolution of thinking in the West, certainly about how the Wagner Group and proxy forces like it could really pose a danger to stability and security in the international arena. Some of those lessons have been learned the hard way from, some instances of direct engagements between U.S. special forces and Wagner forces in Syria, for instance, in early 2018. That was a very historic moment when something like 200 Wagner forces were killed in that engagement. It was the first time Russian and American soldiers had gone at it on the battlefield since the Vietnam War. So the escalation risks certainly were, I think, known and understood by the U.S. government, but the response was always a little bit muddled. And Europe was extremely divided on responding to the rise of the Wagner Group. Some countries wanted to see Yevgeny Prigozhin put on the sanctions list as early as 2014, 2015. Some wanted to see, his compatriots and his businesses put on the sanctions list. But it wasn't really until 2022 that there was this kind of precipitating cause, the invasion of Ukraine, that really forced and catalyzed actual policy action. Fast forward to 2023, 2024, we've now seen some additional understanding, I think, take place in the sense of the Wagner Group is this arm of Russia's military that's on a very long leash. So long, in fact, that it's even difficult for the Kremlin to kind of rein it in. And we saw the prosecution of a Wagner Group affiliated soldier in Norway recently, sorry, in Finland recently. And then we've also seen the potential for a case in Norway. And we've also seen actually some other sort of Wagner Group affiliated operatives in Poland also come under scrutiny and in the UK as well. So the Wagner Group might be dead as a kind of as an actual organization, right? Since the implosion of the Wagner Group African Mutiny in 2023, but the brand still lives on, and apparently somebody in Russia in the Kremlin still thinks it's useful.
Do you think the Wagner Group is just unique to Russia? Do you think also there's sort of this, like other states like the US or China pursuing similar shadow strategies through privatized violence?
Well, I mean, we're talking right now, AR, and we've just learned
Yeah.
about, this apparent story involving potential associates of the Trump administration or Trump
Hmm.
himself
Yeah.
who have been caught out in Greenland trying to foment some sort of influence campaign.
Yeah.
They seem to be also special operators. We don't really know much about the story yet, but what seems likely here is that strangely the Trump administration has taken a page from the Kremlin playbook and tried to roll it out in Greenland and kind of put its own Wagner Group like organization into play. China does have, of course, and does use private military security forces, but usually on contract from other countries. So notoriously, for instance, a lot of Wagner operatives have worked on contract on Belt and Road Initiative projects in places like Pakistan or Afghanistan, Central Asia, and so there has been some experience and some crossover there. The place where people like to kind of make the comparison is in the South China Sea, where you have these kind of what they call little blue men who act as proxies in the waterway battlefields, over the South China Sea. So, but nobody has been as successful as Russia in kind of transforming this narrative of historic political collapse into a revival of an empire, right? I mean, that's kind of the sweep of what Wagner brings to the table is really its magic secret sauce.
Hmm. Okay, we talked about Wagner, what they were or who they are, their influence across Russia's actions, and like I mentioned earlier, I don't feel like the average voter, American voter, American citizen just doesn't know much about Wagner. We just see what we see on social media or mainstream media. So for the everyday Americans trying to understand this conflict, what is the single most important thing about Wagner Group that they need to know, if there is just one? There could be more.
Maybe the top takeaway is the Wagner Group is a barometer for how committed Vladimir Putin is to extending the reach of Russia beyond its own borders. When you expend that kind of money, billions of dollars, to raise up a ghost army that's deployed around the world, that commits, we don't know, probably hundreds of war crimes and atrocities, that then documents them online, and trots them out on social media apps like their trophies or medals or sort of badges of honor. We should all be really worried about a country as adversarial to Western interests as Russia, because the Wagner Group, what it really tells us is Putin is prepared to go to any kind of extreme in pursuing its ends, and that militarism in Russia is going to be a long-standing issue, even if tomorrow, Donald Trump magically is able to suture together a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia. Zelensky and Putin shake hands. The one thing that will not go away is this high octane militarism that really fed the rise of the Wagner Group. And that is going to be a perennial problem in Russia, that is going to be kind of a challenge for the West to manage for a long time to come.
To go off of that, Trump's interaction and Trump's, attempt at peace negotiation during his term to achieve just any sort of settlement agreement. You have mentioned that Trump has a complicated relationship with Russian power players. So what concrete examples illustrate this connection that us voters, us as citizens should understand?
Yeah, well, let me start with the one that most people know or think they know, but maybe like they don't know, right? Let's dial back to 2015. Donald Trump is coming down that golden escalator. He's announcing his candidacy for the presidency for the 2016 elections. Everybody's surprised. Most people shrug, right? Nobody takes it seriously until it does get serious, right? With the primaries. Not that, many months later. He's a loud, brash, bold political candidate, the kind of which really the Republican Party hadn't seen since Ronald Reagan ran for office. And at the same time, the social media environment, right, the internet and how we experience it just as everyday Americans is totally changing, right? We're moving from, Facebook 1.0, which is kind of glitchy, to a little bit slicker Facebook 2.0. More and more people of different generations, different backgrounds are using social media. And it's there that the roads between Russian influence, Trump's connections, the Wagner Group, and Yevgeny Prigozhin meet, with this massive social media influence campaign where the Internet Research Agency, which is, AKA the troll farm, is deployed to foment this kind of faux polarization between different parts of online America. Many people remember like Black Lives Matter was just getting its start then. And
Mm,
so, Internet Research Agency, would start these Black Lives Matter groups
yeah.
and then spew all this pro-leftist, really extreme kind of rhetoric, um, aimed at, inflaming opinions on the other side, the pro-police,
Mm,
back the blue forces, right? And we saw those clashes play out not only online, but the Internet Research Agency was able to get people to show up for rallies where it was like support Trump, down with Clinton,
mm,
and all of this was sort of manufactured online for just a couple $100,000. And that was, Yevgeny Prigozhin. That was the man behind the Wagner Group. Was the same man who was behind fomenting this social media campaign. By the way, which also targeted the UK and was is largely credited for being extremely influential in swaying the campaign and the Brexit vote, that followed just soon after that. So, and of course, there are many other instances that you can look at where the Internet Research Agency was deployed around the world to either foment polarization and discord in democracies or encourage a kind of pro-authoritarian stance. So that's what Americans really need to understand is that there's a lot of connectivity between online proxy warfare via Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and social media and real world proxy warfare where you're shooting guns and trying to take territory and seize the initiative from a rival state.
Yeah, from 2015 onward, it seems like there was sort of this, for lack of better words, civil war between just divided groups. You said people, came one point Black Lives Matter, people supporting police, and then it's sort of like kind of like a cloud, just getting more expansive over time up till now. To before I ask this one question, to go on Prigozhin just a little bit, his rise and fall. Um, what does that whole story reveal about the loyalty and betrayal in Putin's inner circle? Is it like sort of like this kind of tornado or like cloud forming where it's just getting bigger, 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 splitting, sort of like that analogy that you mentioned?
Yeah. Every time I think about Yevgeny Prigozhin and his relationship with Putin, it's a little bit kind of like how I think about the conversation between, James Comey and Donald Trump. It's like I hear that song, Kendrick Lamar, loyalty, loyalty, loyalty,
Ah, yeah,
right? Like it's
yeah,
it's all about
yeah.
like, what would you do for the ones you're loyal to?
Mm,
And the Prigozhin story is just like 100% about that, omerta mafia
mm,
deep cuts loyalty. I'll hide your secrets. You scratch my back. I'll do for you what nobody else will do, and you're gonna make sure that I'm okay. That's the relationship with Prigozhin and Putin. It's complicated.
mm.
It's not like they're
Okay.
best friends, but Putin knows that among the many people in his inner circle that will keep his confidence when he's sitting at a table full of diplomats or a table full of heads of state, um, it will be Yevgeny Prigozhin. When he wants somebody to spy on those people at that table, it will be Yevgeny Prigozhin. And their relationship becomes one of master and servant, a little bit kind of like, king and sort of top butler in a way,
Mm.
but in this instance, top chef. That loyalty is so key, and it also is the recipe that ultimately kind of brings Prigozhin down because, you know, Prigozhin expects, because he comes from this kind of criminal background, right? He spent 10 years almost in prison for thuggery and, robbery and assault. He expects that the rules, the mafia rules, are the ones that are going to keep everything on an even plane. What he doesn't realize is it's Putin's rules, right? It's the master's rules that ultimately determine what loyalty really means. And they're both feeling a sense of betrayal by the end of their story.
Thank you for expounding upon that. So before Trump's rise in his second term, and even up till now, we just hear a lot about peace negotiations. But based on your research, how does the Wagner factor put into Putin's plan B? And please explain that too, even while diplomats are talking.
Yeah, if you had asked me this question, AR, like maybe a year ago before Donald Trump was reelected to office, I would have said that the Wagner Group's atrocities would factor into the end game for negotiations between Russia and Ukraine.
Hmm.
No doubt, right?
Wow. Okay.
Because, you know, I've met enough Ukrainians who have been at the sticky end of Wagner Group operations um, to know that people are not going to forget very easily what happened in Ukraine, and they will long remember the Wagner Group's role. I'm going to point to one, okay, that some people may remember, but probably is a little obscure. And this is the battle for the Azovstal steel plant, which was really epic at the beginning of the war. and the Wagner Group was there on site. Part of that battle, there was a whole movie that Prigozhin made about it, a lot of propaganda, and they were responsible for managing the prisoner exchange and detainees that came out of the deal between Russia and Ukraine that caused, that resulted in a ceasefire briefly at the Azovstal plant. And many human rights activists in Ukraine and frankly in Europe have pointed to that moment and one that happened soon after that was a firebombing of a prison where you had a couple hundred Ukrainian detainees who were incinerated, basically. Some survived, but it was a really massive casualty event. So there's just so many instances like that where, again, I would have said a year ago, Zelensky is never going to be in a position to be able to say, yes, we're gonna write that one off, and
Mm.
the Wagner Group doesn't really matter, and the atrocities that they committed didn't matter. Now it's interesting that here we are now. Trump is trying to negotiate with Putin, Zelensky. The question of human rights and atrocities really hasn't come up. Now the question of children who have been taken from Ukraine into Russia or into Belarus has come up repeatedly as a negotiating point. But I think it's really interesting that somehow even Zelensky has kind of shifted the priority list in terms of reparations and recompense for atrocities committed and justice and accountability for atrocities committed in Ukraine, not just by the Wagner Group, but other organizations and other outfits that have been operating there.
To touch on Zelensky just a little bit further, as you watched him come into power, evolve as a wartime leader, has there been any moments that showed you that he truly understood the Wagner threat that, in a way that his advisors didn't?
Yeah, there is this signal moment. I'm not sure. I think that there was a real debate specifically over Bakhmut within the Zelensky administration. And you might remember General Zaluzhny was then in charge of military operations for Ukraine.
Hmm.
He's kind of an older, Ukrainian officer with a little bit more experience from the Soviet times. Some people kind of cast him as a little bit old school. And he became quite determined to clash with Wagner at Bakhmut. In the meantime, there was this, I think, internal debate amongst Zelensky's advisors about whether that was a good idea. At the same time, there was this backstory of Wagner and the hostage thing that happened in 2019, right? And then this other, threat from Wagner as a potential, assassination threat to Zelensky. And I do think that the Battle of Bakhmut, I think there was a lot of debate, but maybe Zelensky missed his chance to quash that debate and actually turn the tables, because I think many people look at Bakhmut as a signal failure on the part of the Ukrainian military in terms of the strategic losses there and the actual value of the actual territory.
I have just questions clustered into two sections, and then I believe we can wrap this up. For people who think mercenaries are just guns for hire, what's the bigger game Wagner is playing that threatens global security?
Well, I mean, guns for hire is not necessarily a good thing if guns for hire are not accountable to the clients that sponsor them.
Hmm.
And importantly, if they don't, you know, adhere to international and local laws, that's always a problem. Nobody wants guns for hire out there. I mean, what's the difference between guns for hire that are called mercenaries and guns for hire that are organized crime mafia bosses, right? Like, I
Yeah,
mean, not a
yeah, yeah.
lot. So just number one at base, guns for hire are problematic because they're often difficult to control and often difficult to hold to account.
Hmm.
And you don't really want that in any environment, least of all an environment where there are warring factions. And often
Hmm.
that's, of course, where they're the most useful. The second issue, with mercenaries that people need to understand, and organizations like the Wagner Group, is they do a lot of laundering of money.
Hmm.
Oftentimes, some of their payment and the recompense comes from very shady arrangements between either states or state enterprises or big corporations that help states survive and kind of elevate the economies of states, um, who can't otherwise do business in a given territory, but want to do it because it's going to be really lucrative. And mercenaries paper that over. So kind of dangerous, right? Because when you don't know where money's coming from, it can have a lot of dark influences. Um, and the other, I guess, is, you know, people need to understand that mercenaries are addicted to the lifestyle too.
Mm.
And the addiction isn't just to that freewheeling adventurism, it's also an addiction to the violence. And we all have to ask ourselves, is that okay? When does that become a problem in a setting where people are trying to figure out a way toward peace?
Yeah. Okay. Still on this kind of topic of like the future of wartime or warfare and governance. So, seeing that you studied Putin for years, and could there possibly be just another, state actor might be replicating the same thing? What does his reliance and or mentioning other people's reliances on mercenary fighters, which tell us about who those people really are, like the Putin and other state actors behind a strong man image.
Yeah. So the one takeaway I have from studying the Wagner Group, Putin, their rise, is the people who are close to Putin. Many of them are former KGB agents, right? Um, they kind of view the idea of military power as something where people are expendable.
Mm,
People who fight on behalf of Russia are expendable. People who are at the other end of Russia's targeting are expendable. And so that's one, is that their attitudes toward human lives are pretty callous.
mm,
They don't care, and they're willing to exploit the vulnerability of a population. In this instance, oftentimes veterans who are out of work and kind of out of sorts, um, to turn that around and use it as a weapon of war, essentially. And that says a lot about what they think about their own people. It says a lot about what they think about the lack of capacity within their own conventional military to execute strategic aims on behalf of Russia. It clearly, I think, shows that a dissatisfaction with the way the Russian military is run. If you have a million man army and you need to raise this other kind of paper proxy army, to the tune of pennies on the dollar compared to what you might pay for the military. What that says is that Russia can't do what it needs to do without way overpaying for military services. It doesn't have enough men. It doesn't have enough political will amongst its population. And importantly, it doesn't have the staying capacity to fight a war against even a smaller neighboring state like Ukraine and actually win it quickly without the assistance of mercenary forces. That's pretty telling. And instead of looking at Russia as this kind of giant rival to the United States, second largest military in the world, we might need to reassess our understanding of Russian capacity to fight wars.
are we heading into a new era of mercenary dominated conflicts? And if so, what does that mean for international law or peacekeeping?
We are definitely in a new era of conflict,
Yeah.
where we see the rise and proliferation of mercenary forces. Some are on a much smaller scale than the Wagner Group. Even now in Africa, we've seen Romanian origin mercenary forces. We've seen all kinds of things happening. We've seen Americans in Venezuela trying to foment a coup. I mean, we've seen all kinds of things where privatized, contracted mercenary forces have been deployed to project power, to extend the strategic reach of states. In some cases, it's states who are aligned with certain industries. And I think one thing that we really have to look out for is the ways in which the changes in the fossil fuel industry could actually accelerate the resort to proliferation of mercenary forces. The more There is this kind of tension around the switch from fossil fuels, oil and gas, to potentially battery powered technologies and renewables that rely on critical minerals. The more we're going to see, I think, a real tension in the industry to kind of maintain its hold on the infrastructure and territory that's built over many, many years.
Mhm.
And that is one reason for the rise of the Wagner Group, for sure. It's just the oil and gas industry. And I wonder actually if there won't be a moment, maybe in the next 30, 40 years, when there are more electric cars on the roads, less fossil fuel cars on the roads.
Mm.
If then critical minerals, right, and that are located in Latin America, that are located in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of the Pacific, don't become the new vector for mercenary operations.
Do you think AI or digital surveillance plays a role or will play a role in the future evolution of groups like Wagner?
That is a very good question. What we have seen is that what the Wagner Group offered wasn't just mercenary services. It wasn't just muscle, right? It wasn't just military muscle. It was also political subterfuge online. We saw that with the political influence campaign in 2016 in the U.S. presidential elections, and we also know that there's a lot of overlap or kind of integration between mercenary hackers for hire and those on the kind of more pointy end of the spear in proxy warfare. And I do think we're going to see a fusion of that. And I do think that hackers in general are going to use AI to do all kinds of nefarious things because they won't have to think really hard. They'll just type some prompts to develop the kind of code that would exploit a zero-day gap and vulnerability. So yes, in a kind of indirect way, I think there probably will be some integration.
And just to go off of one more cluster of questions in one group on the process of getting this information. Halfway through the book, I suggested to a friend to read the book too, and she got it, and she made me she it would bother her if I didn't ask these two questions. So this is on behalf of her. What were the biggest journalistic or safety risks you encountered while researching and writing this book?
I get asked that question a lot, and I don't like to talk about it too openly
No problem.
because then you make yourself more vulnerable. Um, I will say reporting on Russia always makes everybody nervous. Like if you ever spent
Yeah.
time in Russia, if you know kind of the Maxim Moscow rules, which is like don't talk unless you're walking and you're outside and you're far away from any microphones that might pick up your voice. Yeah, I mean you're always paranoid, right? I
Yeah.
certainly have been always paranoid about my security, about penetration, about hacking. My phone was hacked once. I pretty much
Oh,
suspect
wow.
it was probably Russians. Pretty good evidence for that, I would say. And that was early on in my research, even before I started working on the book itself. So I always worry about, information risks for sure. On the other hand, I have lived and worked in lots of kind of crazy places, including Afghanistan, including Pakistan. I've seen a lot of stuff. And I don't want to sound callous or like I'm inured to the possibility of risk. But how much more risky can it be for me than it is for the many, many civilians who are exposed to everyday hazards in places like Gaza, in
Yeah.
places like Ukraine, in places like Afghanistan? You know, um, sure, sometimes I'm paranoid about it, and I know my family is too sometimes, but
Yeah.
these are the risks that come with the job.
Yeah. Yeah. As I mentioned to you before the recording, I mean, being halfway around the world, across the world, definitely share some similarities with that. So, the second question is, how did you gain access to some of the more sensitive or classified materials and sources? And if you don't need to, if you don't want to, wish to expand on that, it's completely fine too.
No, I mean, I do work in the open. In fact, like really, unlike a lot of folks, I really believe in transparency and showing your work and talking about kind of your methods. One, if anything, it protects you from any kind of, false accusations about your own ethics and your integrity.
Yeah, good
Um,
point.
but two, I think it's important for other journalists, other activists, researchers to understand if you want to do, you know, hard things, ask hard questions about hard places that are difficult to reach, you're going to have to get really creative. So Early on, when I was starting to research the Wagner Group, and this is around 2018, I took a course with Bellingcat, which is an open source research collective. They use a lot of online techniques to piece together kind of the footprint of people online, as well as kind of look at and reconstruct events from digital breadcrumbs. They're super famous for that. So I took a course with them, and I learned a little bit about how to use those tools to better understand this wild world out there where Russia kind of does this nefarious stuff. And that was hugely important. But the second thing that kind of distinguished, I guess, my work from maybe Bellingcat and the work that we've done at Future Frontlines, the organization that I run at New America, is we combine those techniques of open source with big data analysis. So we started to kind of experiment and explore a network analysis of these large scale social media groups where Wagner was like kind of the central focus of the channels. And there we were able to kind of piece together a sense of the culture and the kind of the social movement aspects of the Wagner Group. And then the last and probably the most important is we have always mined open source, open data
Mm.
from leaked sources. Very long into the writing of the book, an organization called C4ADS here in Washington offered us a chance to examine about 130,000 leaked files from Yevgeny Prigozhin's businesses, and that
Mhm.
was super eye-opening. It wasn't like, oh, this is all new. It was more like, oh, yep, this confirms that, right? Or this connects those dots that we weren't able to really connect before. So those three things, the kind of open source, kind of manual stuff, old-fashioned investigation, big data science, and then exploiting leaked documents were really important.
And if there is one misconception about Putin or Wagner that you would like to, I guess, shatter for readers, what would it be?
The Wagner Group is not a company.
Hmm.
It's not a unitary organization. It's not in any corporate registry. It's not like Blackwater. It's not like McDonald's. It's not like any other organization you could possibly think of. It is a network of shell companies and individuals who profit from those shell companies linked to Russia's military security intelligence enterprise. That's it. It's not a company and it ain't private
Yeah, that's something that most Americans should be aware of, if not all of them.
for sure.
That is all the questions I have. I appreciate you so much for coming on and answering all these questions. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. You asked good questions. Thanks.
Appreciate it. Uh, guys, don't forget to like and subscribe. Links to her book will be in the description below. And there's any parting words or last words that you'd like to say, please do so.
Yeah. Keep fighting for the truth.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. Thank you, Candace. Appreciate you again for coming out. And yeah, guys, show her some love, support the book, support her. Uh, Everything will be in the description below. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you.